Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 will be opening in theaters in a few days. It will be the second MCU Phase 5 movie to be released following the release of MCU's first Phase 5 movie earlier this year, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which flopped in theaters due to only earning $212 million domestically and $466 million globally. And both of those figures were very close to projections that I had made for the movie of $211 million domestically and $480 million globally, as I had talked about in my video that I had released on March 13th entitled Ant-Man 3 Will Likely Flop, Breaking Even Becoming Increasingly Unlikely. About 3 weeks ago, the trades, such as Deadline, were projecting that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 could potentially earn around $130 million domestically during its opening weekend. Given that the movie has a very large production budget of $250 million, if we multiply that by 2.5 to estimate the film's break-even point, we get a figure of $625 million to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. At that time, I had released a video in which I made projections for how well Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 may do in theaters by basing them on the performances of two previous MCU movies. 2017's Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which was part of MCU's very successful Phase 3, and the much more recent Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, which was part of MCU's Phase 4 and opened in theaters just last year. By using those films' domestic weekend-to-weekend box office earnings percentage drops, their weekday box office earnings percentages, and their domestic share percentages to account for their international box office performances, I was able to create projections for how well Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 might earn at the box office, as I showed in the video that I had released at that time. From those projections based on those earlier MCU films and a projected $130 million domestic opening weekend box office for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, I had projected that the final global box office for the movie could potentially range globally as high as $772 million to as low as around $617 million, with an average between the two of around $695 million. Given the film's estimated break-even point of $625 million, the overall spread between the two extremes tended to favor the film ultimately breaking even, provided that its domestic opening weekend box office is at least around $130 million. But yesterday, the trades, including Deadline, released updated opening weekend projections for the movie, and they are lower than the projections from 3 weeks ago. They're now projecting a domestic opening weekend box office of around $110 million, which is $20 million lower than the previous projections. They're also projecting $140 million from the international box office for a global opening weekend total of $250 million. So when I plug that projected domestic opening weekend box office of $110 million into the same projection calculations that I had previously used, the resulting projected final box office for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is, not surprisingly, nowhere near as good as when I had calculated it using the projected domestic opening weekend box office of $130 million. So using $110 million as a projected domestic opening weekend box office, the resulting projected final box office for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 ranges globally as high as $654 million to as low as $522 million for an average final projection of around $588 million, which is well below the film's estimated break-even point of $625 million. In fact, the range itself is now mostly below the film's estimated break-even point, so my previous optimism that the film would probably break even is now rather doubtful that it can break even. If Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 doesn't break even, this will clearly show that audiences around the world are tired of the MCU. And if that happens, I believe that a lot of the blame can be shouldered by the failed MCU Phase 4 films that were overly woke and wrecked the MCU's former financial success. As the animated Super Mario Bros. Movie continues its global box office domination and climbs well above $1 billion, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 may be lucky if it gets up to $600 million. Unless people really turn out in droves to see Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, this could be a sign that the MCU is finally over as a franchise in terms of profitability. Just as the Star Wars franchise has been deeply damaged by Kathleen Kennedy at Lucasfilm, Kevin Feige listening to the now fired Victoria Alonso at Marvel Studios to produce the failed Phase 4 movies may have rendered the MCU similarly damaged and dysfunctional. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is the third superhero movie to hit theaters in 2023, with Warner Bros.' next DC Comics movie, The Flash, scheduled to open in theaters next month. After more than 20 continuous years of having multiple superhero movies released every year, I strongly believe that a growing number of people are becoming burned out on them, and their increasingly identity politics-driven storylines aren't helping their bottom lines either. The Super Mario Bros. Movie is a welcome change that isn't pushing any political agendas and isn't a superhero movie, both of which are probably why its billion-dollar-plus earnings just continue to grow at the box office. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.